we'll get going here and welcome everybody to Qwinix's DTC GCP Meetup for May. Say that 10 times fast. We will get going. Okay, so the agenda for tonight. We'll do some GCP updates as we do every week. Talk about upcoming meetups, and then we will hit tonight's topic. Rob Lindsay talks resource hierarchy and IAM in GCP. So over the last month, we have had a few interesting updates from GCP. The most recent is that GKE auto node repair will be enabled by default starting on 28th of May this year. And what that means is in any GKE cluster, when a node begins to deteriorate, have some kind of service interruption or downright crashes, it will be replaced automatically by the GKE control plane, making the automatic management of GKE even better. We've got new regions. Newest is in Seoul, South Korea. So GCP is spreading out all over the world. BigQuery data transfer service is now generally available. And that enables you to transfer data much more quickly into BigQuery. Two compute engine announcements. The AMD EPYC-based VM family is now generally available, and that's for the second generation EPYC CPU. And the E2 VMs are now in GA, and those are up to 16 vCPUs and 8 gigabytes of memory per vCPU. Also in GKE, enabling TPUs, tensor processing units, is in beta, and that will help with your machine learning jobs that you can run in GKE. For cloud data flow, SQL, using SQL as a language is now in beta. So for moving and monitoring data between two sources, you'll be able to use SQL query statements. And then for Cloud SQL itself, it now supports SQL Server API or compliant API, and that's generally available. Google has come up with their own artifact registry, and that's now in beta. So now as you build your source code artifacts, your jar files or packages, you can deploy them right into the artifact registry and then have them available to other components and systems within your environment. The Anthos sample deployment on GCP is now generally available, and that comes as a marketplace app which uses Google Deployment Manager to roll out 2 user clusters and the control plane, get everything set up, and deploy a couple applications, as well as the Anthos service mesh and all the various ACM and all the various Anthos components. So it's literally a few clicks and you've got Anthos running. Cloud load balancing now has IAM conditions, and that is generally available as well. And one thing that was kind of missing for a while, but Secret Manager is now generally available. That's a huge piece as you're deploying more workloads. Identity platform MFA, so using a multi-factor authentication, is now in beta. For upcoming meetups, on the 13th of May, and I've mixed in here meetups and cloud study jams, but they're all on GCP. So on the 13th of May, we'll do a study jam on Google Cloud Platform Essentials. And for the study jams, we will provide you a code that gets you free quick lab credits and allows you to do this work hands-on for free. It's a real nice thing that Google does. And then for our June meetup, we'll do intro to VPCs and networking. So we'll walk through how you configure networks and how networking is implemented within GCP. On the 10th of June, we'll do another cloud study jam, and this will be focused on cloud architecture. For the July meetup, we'll be talking about cloud storage and compute engine and how you would use those things together. And then for the August meetup, we'll be doing Bigtable, Cloud SQL, Cloud Spanner, and Cloud Data Store. We'll be talking about all the different functions and how these things are similar or different. Are there any questions before we move on to tonight's topic? All right, I will hand it over to Mr. Rob Blanzy. He is our Director of Cloud Security, and he will be presenting the topic tonight.
All right, I think I could do this. So we're going to have a little fun today and present a window. Oh, let's not present that window. Cool. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Awesome.
Yes.
Boom. So we're going to talk about the fun topic of resource hierarchy in IAM. And for a lot of organizations that are starting out in GCP, they kind of make a few mistakes along the way. And as we understand how hierarchies work, we can better organize our enterprise to consume these resources and understand the full functionality of IAM across all these resources. We're not going to dive super deep into IAM today because that would be a good day session. There's a lot we can do with constraints and roles and all this fun stuff with services. But we're going to get a good introduction to how these interact and some of those best practices in consuming them. With GCP, and a lot of this will be familiar if you've been in IT for a while, there's a hierarchy that's always in place. And for Google, it starts at the organizational level. That organizational level is really kind of like, think of it like a company name. Think of it as a place to start where we can integrate with G Suite if we're leveraging it, and we can really use the functionality there to start pushing down some of those controls. In our folder section, this is just how we think about our organization, not our enterprise, rather, how we want to have departments and what teams and what departments are going to be organized. Pretty straightforward. These can be moved around and expanded, and it makes things healthy for administration really to understand, and especially as we start putting IAM policies down, how things are controlled. The project is where the work happens. So you can have multiple projects aligned to a folder. And again, now we're getting more granular in our controls. And then we get down to the resources we're going to consume. And these resources are any of those elements, those artifacts that exist within a service like, say, GCE or GKE. Now, one important thing about organizations is there's some services within GCP. And did you see my screen switch? Just want to make sure.
Yep.
Perfect. So in GCP, some services are dependent upon an organizational level. Now, this is my test little account that I utilize for other talks with customers and to kind of do POCs and demos. And you can see here, I need to select an organization in order to start utilizing some of these features in billing. In Security Command Center, this is another service that Google provides that also requires an organizational level to be functional. Without that organizational level, you can't see what's happening because this specific service, SEC, dives into everything. It looks at everything across your organization, your projects, all your resources. Are there any threats? Are there any vulnerabilities and all that fun stuff? And then other services are very project dependent. So having projects assigned to something like Cloud Armor does not look at things at an organizational level. So even as we consider using and consuming GCP, we have to understand those services that are project dependent or organizationally dependent. Now, when we get into the organizational level, that there's a workflow of how an organization policy works, what that administrator does. Now, the org admin is kind of that top level, almost behind the scenes Mr. Wizard, who has a lot of control to issue policies and stuff like that. And a best practice is to ensure that there are multiple sources that have that access. Some people will create a generic account. Some people will create multiple accounts. A lot of enterprises will have, security will have, say, an admin rights over it, where that is kind of locked away, so to speak. They don't actively utilize this, but if there's an organizational event in the security space, they can now, have access to that organization. And the org admin defines policies that really set the first stage of what your organization, how it'll be controlled. And often these are fairly liberal. And as you get down to very specific levels in your hierarchy, you start to put in place, heavier constraints, like this user can only access this dev project and these specific things he or she can only view. So it gets pretty granular as we get into how resources are controlled from an organizational level down to resources. Now, when we start creating these policies, we leverage Cloud IAM. And Cloud IAM allows us to assign policies at different levels. We can assign things at the organizational level. We can then get a bit more granular, say on the folder level, where we might have, say, Team A has a resource that is allowed to interact with all projects, but Team B might not, or might have access to one project. We might have things at the top level folder. And as we get into projects, we can define additional resources or policies rather. So these project level policies allow that further level of granularity, where we might say a person in security has organizational view rights over everything, but Susie only has rights in dev to create VMs. And we can get more specific, and as Mac pointed out, there's always resources that will obtain more IAM type of abilities where you can apply constraints. Not every service has this, but some of these resources, like getting into cloud sharing, getting into VMs, getting into how we granularly control subnets, we can put resource constraints within those environments. So I can say if someone can create in GCE, they have the rights to spin up VMs, they might not have the rights to say push down a firewall rule. And as we have large organizations, these controls are usually with a different team. So the networking team in one enterprise might have the ability to create firewall rules, but the infrastructure team does not. So that gives us that ability to kind of shape our IAM policies based upon our own company's organization. And it makes it very helpful. And we can also get incredibly granular. So if we get into production, we can significantly lock things down. We can have very heavy, policies maybe at the folder level because it's production, and it gets even heavier. And then we can lock down services, ensure services don't have too many rights, too much power. And we can identify what's wrong. And if you look in SEC, it'll show you some of those elements where you might have a service that has too much power, too much control, and then you can go ahead and make adjustments. Best practices really in this case, from my experience, even if you're starting out in GCP, is start to define this first. Like when your first steps in architecture really should be that resource level. How are you going to map that out? And then what are your first layers of IAM going to look like, say, at the organization and folder level? That'll help plan for the future, and also realizing that these are going to change over time, because we could have mergers, acquisitions that incorporate new teams, that blend teams. We could have teams merging, teams dissipating. We could have the infrastructure team split up into a DevOps team. We could have a DevSecOps team, and that's fine. But if we start out realizing we have to have a solid, fluid organizational structure, it'll make everything else in the future much easier. And also we think about things up to the project level. We can always add new projects to a folder, but what are those projects for? From a security perspective, it's always easier for me to have less, because too much data is overwhelming. but we still need some sort of consistency across our organizational architecture. So in this case here, as we see in this example, we may have team A has access to a QA test in a prod, and that might be something we follow with every team. They all get those 3 environments. We acquire a new team that is working on something that's only internal facing. Maybe they only need a test and a dev environment. And we might create something off to the side for, say, a sandbox where we have active monitoring on, but we're letting people explore. The concerns there are more on the building side is what are they consuming? How are they consuming it? It might be open to test various services within GCP, but we also want to ensure that those costs are contained to a degree. And whatever access they have in that specific folder and subfolders and projects is isolated. We want to keep that nice isolation. So it's not like back in the day in NT or Linux, you might have like a root user admin that has this total power over everything. We want to keep it very granular and isolated. And also from being compromised, there's a lot of attacks and threats. When we can put all these constraints in place, these IAM policies in place, it minimizes the impact of an internal threat. And that's what we want. We want to be able to isolate and minimize impact as much as possible. Policy inheritance, and this is an example from Google here, is something that starts from the top and works its way down. And this can be a little confusing here, but essentially if you just kind of follow the shapes and colors, you can see where they're allowing and reducing what is allowed. And this is something is a good mapping exercise as we create an IAM policy. I'll often whiteboard things like this where I want to follow the trail of my policy. And there's tools as well out there that will look at your policies to see if it looks, what is the output going to be. But for me personally, I like the visualization of drawing on a whiteboard, seeing how this policy is going to impact everything from the top of the hierarchy on down. It gives me a better understanding of what resources need to be consumed, what shouldn't be consumed. Am I allowing something in that I should not be in, and I need to readjust my policy? I might need to say a false statement on like an organizational policy and then implement one specific thing. I may want to say, hey, this is my sandbox. We can take the constraints from the top level and allow everything in place. This then will give those users a lot of ability, and from a security perspective, I know I need to pay a little, even though it's a sandbox, I need to keep an active eye on that to see what's happening. Because from a threat perspective, that's where an attacker is going to focus. Attack's going to be focusing upon. They're going to want that. They're going to look for those areas where they can do the most damage. And if we know this and we have it isolated, it's pretty safe for us to control. And as we look at things over time with resources, we want to make adjustments that are far more granular than we even see in this basic model. And that's what Google's done a really good job with all their policies. You can really, their old model was like a legacy model, like you're the admin of this and you're whatever of that. Now you can get super granular. And that really helps. It's a little bit more time consuming, but it makes isolation much easier. So when you look at those IAM policies, it is a good idea to try to get as granular as possible and treat it more like a DevOps practice or a developer practice, where we're going to try to implement something and see how it works, and then we're going to iterate. Maybe we're going to add a little bit more constraints to, say, a service or to users' rights, or maybe you want to get production VMs to a point where they do not have the ability to log in as admin or root, or no user login whatsoever. But that's something we can work up to as we test and validate our policies to really ensure we have that nice granular control. And the more of those controls that are in place, it is a little bit more to manage. That's why we just have to keep track of what's going on and how it's impacting those users. And getting closer to that end user experience will tell us, are users getting what they need? Do they feel too constrained? If so, why? Is it because they just prefer to have admin rights and they no longer do? Or is there a specific thing they need to accomplish? And that's where, with all these constraints that Google has provided, we can identify, do they just need to view a resource? Do they need to actually be an editor of that resource? Do they need more controls? Do they need less controls? And it's just that's where security is, especially in the IM space, is to really have that iteration. It shouldn't be a one and done, because new things are coming out, new ways of being attacked, new ways of controlling our infrastructure, and it's pretty vital. And we're seeing this across several cloud service providers where they do want to dive in deeper. They do want to have more granular controls. And with Google spinning up billions of containers all the time and destroying them and having billions of users, they really need to understand how granular can they get to give us end users that freedom, like we own something, like we have control of it, but yet it's tightly controlled. And that's also another topic someday to get into zero trust networks and beyond, Corp. So this is a good example from Google, which kind of shows how policies are in place in GCE. You kind of see where we're at in example.com. We got good old Bob at example.com having a good time in our space. So as we put these policies at the organization, project, and even down to the resource level, we can control what Bob has the ability to do. And through the use of IAM, we may allow him to do specific things in certain locations, but in other areas, not so much. This is an example of where we can say, yes, you can go ahead and have access to, say, spin up network resources, control network resources. You're the networking engineer in the cloud that also has firewall as an inherited job responsibility. But say Alice, she can only create compute instances. So in that environment that Bob created, she can go ahead and say, yes, I need some instances, VMs, however you want to call them these days. I used to work at AWS, so I flip between the two. Sorry about that. But the thing that we really want to look at is, does Alice here even need network insert rights? I'm sure she might like it, but following corporate procedure, our enterprise procedures, the networking team is supposed to control that. And maybe down the road, we see in certain environments, we'd let Alice, maybe in a test environment or a POC environment, she might have the ability to insert network changes. But for, say, QA and production, she's not allowed to whatsoever. And this is the isolation as a security person I really appreciate. It's worth it to me to take the time to do this, and it can be frustrating to users, but if there is that frustration, then we have to examine that process. Why would it take Bob so long to, say, update network resources for Alice? Is Bob working 60 hours a week and the only firewall guy? If that's the case, then we need to address another problem, not the fact that Alice doesn't have these rights. And this is all data, right? So we can track this data, and part of building out security teams isn't just about defining threats, mitigating and responding to threats. It's really about what is that corporate culture in consuming these resources when they're at their optimal security point, and where is that breaking processes. So if we can identify and quantify that, we can help shape the organization so it has a smoother transition into a more modernized and very fluid security practice. IAM does a great job of that, and setting up those initial resource hierarchy really helps that foundation. So I know as a security person, I've seen how busy things can get, but getting those security people involved at the beginning of your enterprise projects will help more quickly define what those IAM roles are supposed to be. What are the constraints that need to be in place? And there's probably some things that are templated out already and automatically deployed, so everything is nicely secured for that base level infrastructure. And then that security or SecOps, DevSecOps engineer, whatever you want to call them these days, can work with that project to make modernizations to your project where Alice just doesn't get rights, or maybe for this project she needs to, and we need to identify the reasons why and ensure she has rights to where she should have them, and we're minimizing her rights elsewhere. mean, it's a constant, technology with the cloud has been such a point of iteration because it gives us so many features to work with. It gives us tools to examine what our IAM policies look like. And it gives us really cool tools like SCC and others and even Forseti, which is an open source collaboration with Google, that can examine this infrastructure, that can look at how these policies are put in place. And then we can deliver them with YAML, JSON, and tools like Terraform, where we can deploy them and examine that policy in flight to see if it's meeting the template we put in place that says these things have to be in place or else. So I'm sorry, it's a lot to digest here, but that's really the true power when you think about security, when you think about IAM. It's not a linear thing that is a set and forget, but it's a very active service. In just the sheer fact that we're going to have customers or end users that are going to, leave the company, be removed from the company, transfer to a different location within the company, to a different team. IAM has to always be fluid and identified because we need to make these changes. And those functionalities may exist with other teams. So you might have somebody on the SOC that's handling a piece of it, the NOC handling a piece of it. You may have an onboarding team that handles a piece of it. But that's where security really needs to understand and quantify how IAM is best going to be used in the cloud. And there's a lot of cool things. It's another topic we can get into as well, but how you integrate with services like Okta to further isolate and minimize your organization's threat diameter. I hope I didn't go too fast. I think I may have went a little too fast. But are there any questions that anyone may have, or do you want me to look back at anything else?
Oh, that was awesome, Rob.
Well, perfect. Well, thank you, everyone. I will stop sharing.
How does it fit into like an RBAC model?
Rules-based access controls?
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
I assume you assign things more to roles than to individuals.
Yeah, so with IAM today, you have the ability to really assign it to a specific individual. Like I can say, Jim, Mac, Sanjay, you guys can go off and do very specific things. And Scott here is going to be an org admin who's going to help me build out and control organizational policies down to services where I can be very specific, where if, say, Jim, you wrote an API that needs to talk to something, we can start to look at how we can control and minimize how it interacts, especially on the services side. So if you want to talk to a service, you can be very, very, very granular. And what a lot of customers will do is they'll see, say, they want to create it, they want to talk to Google services, and the API they create may talk to 20 services. And that's giving too much control to one specific location. So we want to kind of minimize that and spread that out. So it gives us the ability to be a bit more isolated, because if someone gets control, if we're compromised, then whoever compromised that service now has the ability to wreak havoc.
Excellent. Any other questions for Rob? All right. Well, I want to again thank everybody for showing up tonight, and thank Qwinix for sponsoring us. And I hope you all have a good rest of your night, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Rob.